Welcome to a conversation between two founders. I'm Niels Kemp Rasmussen from Kemp Associates, and I have here with me Narita Cheah from Paperspace. Welcome, Narita.
Thank you, Niels.
Thanks for joining me today. And I was just wondering, maybe you could share a bit how you got into doing the work you do.
So I graduated and have a background in interior and architecture and went straight into practice right after I finished in London. And after practicing for a decade, I was so amused with spaces, but even more amused with dealing with people, and was really interested to understand the dynamics of working with people in spaces and transition into getting to know more about strategy and change management and organization to support my background in space education.
Okay.
And what about you, Neil? Tell me about yourself.
Well, yeah, so I was originally trained as a lawyer in Denmark, but moving to London about 25 years ago, started working for BP, and they had all these movements with different spaces and organizations merging, and they had all these different offices all over the place. And there was this movement to try and do something with that space. And I had been studying change management in London, and I had continued with organizational psychology. And I was really interested in all these things, and I was working for the real estate team. So I got involved in these projects, and then slowly, I sort of became the internal expert on workplace. And it's just sort of built, it's just sort of grown from there.
Fantastic. It's interesting how you come from a legal background and you went to the other spectrum of looking at strategy and change.
I don't share that very often. But you know what? We've been working together since 2017, and I think we've been very successful. We have a very high rate of both winning projects, but also having very satisfied clients. I was just wondering, what do you think our success is based on?
Well, coming from different backgrounds, between your legal expertise and change, and probably myself in spaces and looking at workplace behaviors, I think that spectrum and background of different dynamics at looking at the same topic in very different lenses and bringing all that together, I would say summarizes where we look at a particular problem statement and look at across multiple lenses to land on something that's tangible for the organization.
Yeah.
And in my experience in the past, strategy was very much almost like a white paper that was written and it sounds really good, but it's very hard to string that across to what spaces actually mean. And when we hand that over typically to another design practice, there are lots of information and relationships that get lost in that transition. And what we're seeing more and more is that when we've engaged with stakeholders from the very beginning from strategy, we can seamlessly take them across the design process and remind them why certain decisions were made and the importance of that in making those design decisions.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think this is where I really like what we do together is that we come at it from two sides of the same spectrum. But you can sit there and you can say, look, this is, you should think about this amount of space for this and this amount of space for that. And you can look at a space and you can do all the numbers, which I can't, and you can sort of really make it real. And I might talk a lot about behaviors and culture and the sort of the softer stuff. But combining those two, the hard with the soft, I think that just feels so great when we can do that together.
Absolutely. I think, Niels, when we go into presentations together, it feels like we kind of chime in at different times, at different topics, and you're particularly very good at summarizing the organization's culture, which is very difficult. Culture is an easy word to say, but to define what that is for an organization is difficult to say, give it 3 words. And to define then what next, and how do we get there? And then break it down to behaviors that you need to instill, and then the how. I think that's where your sort of added advantage lies.
That diversity of both experience and insights is the one where we're actually able to compete against the very big firms who are allegedly, a one-stop shop. You can do all of different services within one entity. But I feel that sometimes those entities start to harmonize and they all do things, in a similar fashion towards a similar or a united goal. And I think our strength is that we actually may sometimes differ in opinions, and we have different perspectives, and to challenge both ourselves and sometimes the clients. So I think in a way, smaller entities coming together can be, in certain situations, be a lot stronger than the one big organization that can do everything.
Yeah. I think my viewpoint on that is when you're running a very large organization, I think it's important to have certain consistencies. So there is a tendency to keep things in a templated fashion. There's a module structured process that you kind of have to get to point A to B to get to Z. But I am seeing that solutions these days are becoming so different, where you may not need to go from A, B, C sequentially, and you may skip a few steps to get to an end point.
Yes.
And I think that's probably the more difficult thing to navigate when you're in a large organization trying to build knowledge and consistency.
Yes.
And I think that's where the flexibility of being small practitioners coming together gives us that advantage.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
You've been practicing, strategy and really sort of mastered that in the last 2 decades. And what do you see fundamentally changing or has changed from the time you started to where you see strategy and change management going?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, way back it was very much focusing on the physical solution. So the workplace as a physical entity to support whatever was going on in that organization. And there was also this promise or opportunity that the workspace would facilitate lots of other changes in the organization by just physically being there. But of course, as I was studying organizational psychology and change management in London and doing projects for BP at the time, I also sort of slowly realized that whatever this catalyst of workspace is at best perhaps passive. But when it combined with an organization who understands what you can do with it, and you layer it with the values and the culture of the organization, and you have a leadership who is actively engaged, you can actually use the platform of workspace to change behaviors. So that's how I got interested in really focusing on why behaviors and culture is really important as a layer when you talk about workplace. But of course, it took a long time before the market started tuning into that. And I really only think that's sort of been the last few years. So that's sort of, for me, been a big thing. And what's going to happen next? What do you think?
I just came back from Manila, and it was very interesting because we were tackling on the topic of designing workplace culture and whether culture influences the workspace, or by physically tackling the workspace, it influences culture. And it was a very interesting viewpoint. So I think smarter organizations use the opportunity when they can to define what culture they want to design, and then they use space as a tool to help them get there.
Yes.
And that's an interesting one, because maybe the new conversation is not just about the space, but while that conversation of creating a new environment is present, to then focus the concerted effort on designing a culture or repositioning the existing culture.
Yeah. But of course that then, requires an organization to be very clear about the culture they want.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So I met a client recently who, seems very small, only like 80 people, and it was really interesting because they were in a fairly open plan environment. But when you sort of dug a little bit deeper, the issue was that people were not communicating. And it wasn't like space was inhibiting the communication, because you could see everybody, but nobody was moving from the desk.
Yeah.
And the point is that open plan is not equivalent to communication and collaboration.
No.
There's something fundamentally happening in the background that's either limiting or stopping people from those behaviors.
Yes.
And a space can't make that happen automatically.
Yes. And I guess that's what happened, right? That people or organizations wanted to have more cross-communication, more cross-collaboration, so they took down the walls, and you ended up with a big open workspace. And that has its benefits, but it also has its downsides. So what we often do is we try and promote this variety of space that supports all these different types of behaviors.
Yeah, so activity-based working is probably where you're sort of going towards, and I think a lot of organizations, if not, have already embraced it. I wonder what you think in terms of the next phase beyond ABW. What are your thoughts?
Well, I was just presenting to senior leadership in this local university after having finished the project, and one of my pieces of advice to them was to stop referring to it as an ABW project, that you now have all this learning and those understanding, and you're moving towards how you're going to make an impact with workspace, that you create your own brand and you call it whatever makes sense for you. But it's really the essence about the space as a platform for the organization, which corresponds with your culture, however that might be in the future, and the behaviors you want to nurture. And then you pull your identity around that as a platform, as a space, and not think about whatever it is that you call it. Because these are industry terms that practitioners like to use, but they may not actually be very relevant for clients, because it has to suit what their own culture and what they want to do.
That's a good point.
Yeah. And then you get into these situations where people are using space differently as well. We work with law firms. Now this is a university I'm talking about. We worked with commercial banks. We worked with production companies, pharmaceutical. We worked with a big range of organizations. What do you think are some of the common issues or challenges that they face?
Well, what I see generally, what has shifted is that I think in the past, a lot of the workspaces were predominantly driven by projects or real estate teams who are tasked to look at leasing, optimization, cost management. But the agenda of, regardless of industries, if the organization is keen to look at real peaked changes in the workplace solutioning, it ultimately has to be driven by the business leaders.
Yes.
And that has to support real estate objectives. Otherwise, we just see a very highly effective use of space and pretty much the same level of productivity or efficiency or satisfaction coming out from employees. Yeah. Because as we all know, space is space and people get used to it, and we kind of go back to old habits.
Yes.
It's very convenient.
It's very true. And it is really hard to change habits. But I think you're right. I think when we worked with clients, where leadership can sort of step in and say, look, I get it now. If I do these things on top of what we do with the physical space, then we're able to move the organization in this direction. Then it's much more powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that whole idea of bringing the vision of what sort of culture do you want to design and then peg it to the workplace, and when you marry those things together, I think that's when you see how your business goals are then going to be achieved, and we all kind of get there together. Yeah. But saying that we're going to get there just because the space is new, I think that's going to be quite a gap to address still in between. Yeah. Rita,
the work that we do together, we have really specialized in helping organizations using the workplace to make a future transformation for the organization. In those situations where we work with clients, can you think of a particular challenge that you overcame that changed how you looked at the work?
So one of my experiences, I would say, from 15 years ago to what I experienced today is 15 years ago, there was probably one single decision maker in the organization who has the autonomy to decide for everyone what's best for them. And the biggest change that I've seen over the last 15 years that it no longer works that way. it requires a group of leaders and their sort of next in line successors to be part of the conversation. And what's really difficult about that is navigating a decision making when you have 15 people in a room versus one person, because they all have a different view about things, and our jobs is still to take them through a process that moves forward. And even though that is challenging, I think what then becomes really important is the baseline of having a strategy that informs them of what are the key goals that they set out to achieve. And that always becomes that whiteboard we go back to and say, remember these conversations we had, these are the things that we want to achieve, and that's why we need to make these decisions become so much more important than before.
Yes, that's a very good example.
And what about yourself, Niels? Well, can you think of something that's fundamentally different moving forward?
Well, I'm not sure it's fundamentally different, but it was a really nice experience. First, it was frustrating, but it was actually ended up with a really nice experience. And it was because there was a very big firm that we were working with, and they wanted a change management. And we came in with a very sort of big program, prescribed and structured, and all the things that we thought they wanted. And actually, they wanted us to work with them, but they didn't want us to work with them in a very structured way. They wanted to co-create the solution with them. And it was frustrating at first because we came in with the different expectations, but it was really good because it turned out, it sort of reminded me of the value of co-creation, and it's a much better way of sitting down with a client and creating the change with the client and having the client to do as much of the change as possible. But of course, it was just sort of a nice challenge to have, because it sort of opens up the mind and think, actually, we should do more of our work that way.
So tell me a little bit more about this co-creation. I mean, it's like the new buzzword. What do you summarize co-creation as, and why is it important in the future?
Well, it's really in essence about engaging the end users and the stakeholders, so that you don't come in and prescribe things, but you get stakeholders to be part of creating what the solution should be. And by doing that, you actually get people to take ownership of the solution, and therefore you already have them engaged, and then it's so much easier to get the engagement moved further out, because then the solutions ideally should then talk to the organization. And
do you think that perhaps that in that journey of co-creation, then the problem kind of becomes theirs, and then they already start that process of collaboration, natural collaboration, to figure things out?
Yes, I think that's very true, and I think that's also provides us with a different type of role. So instead of coming in as a change consulting and running all the engagements and doing all the activities and running it and doing all the scripts, etc., we come in and we become advisors and coaches and helping leaders to conduct most of those exercises and engagement themselves, or engage powerful junior stakeholders to actually go and do. I think it's much more effective for change. So it's really nice we could work with clients who want to go down that path.
Absolutely.
We talked quite a bit now about different aspects of workplace and organization, what they're going through, the challenges. What do you think is the next big thing that we're going to be talking about with clients, or clients will be asking us about?
Right. I think designers in the design industry in general has sort of grown so fast and really picked up the speed of designing spaces that evoke experience for the users, and I think that's great. I think the next level where the space there needs to address user experience is, I feel, very much in service and in the education and promotion of knowledge sharing and collaboration. How do you make that a continuous journey? So it's not just about that the amenities are there, go help yourself. How do we integrate little things that remind the employees that the organization is thinking about them? Putting little things that are conveniences to them. And it's a little bit more effort, perhaps picking up their laundry services, deliveries, just the small things that, or maybe when your child is sick and you don't have any help at home, how could you bring your child to work? Is there a place for you? And you feel that it's not something that I need to feel bad about.
Yeah.
I think that's that little next level where people will then feel they have thought about me as a person.
Yeah. So this whole thing about the employee experience.
Correct.
They come to work, they experience this, they have these associated values, they are able to do these, they're empowered, and that fits really well with the physical space that's geared to do that. And if you then layer it with the organization's understanding of these aspects and the leadership buy-in and engagement in this, then you have a really powerful mechanism going on.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about going from a 5-day work week to a 4-day work week, or at least the Europeans are telling us so. But in order to do that, I think we need to do so much more in a day then.
Yeah.
And I think we could be possibly a lot more productive in those 4 days if all the little kind of small things that we also need to weave in a day becomes quite seamless for the person.
Yeah.
And I think in the organization, doing that little bit more for the employees, it's amazing how much more the employees will go a step beyond to do their best for the organization. So I think it's very much a two-way traffic journey.
Very true. That's very true.